Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to AfA Connect. My name is Eileen and I'm the coordinator for AfA. So I will be your host and moderator this afternoon for the topic this afternoon, tackling burnout in the animal advocacy sector, an essential topic that I trust everyone is ready to engage with. Working in the animal protection movement is both rewarding and challenging, often exposing dedicated individuals to high levels of stress and trauma. Those who tirelessly work to elevate animal suffering frequently encounter emotional and psychological hurdles such as burnout, compassion fatigue, stress injury, and vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue, in particular, is a profound and often overlooked occupational hazard that affects many in our community. It arises when the constant exposure to distressing situations and the relentless empathy for animals in need begin to take a toll on our mental and emotional well-being. Today's session is designed to empower you with knowledge and practical strategies to recognize and combat these challenges. Before we dive into it, I have the great pleasure to introduce Jessica Dolce, the founder of Compassion in Balance and our speaker for today. Jessica is a certified compassion fatigue educator who brings 20 years of experience working with animals to an online training platform, the Compassion in Balance program. She is an adjunct faculty member at the Shelter Medicine program at the University of Florida. Jessica holds a Master of Science in Adult and Higher Education degree and certificates in grief education, QPR gatekeeper suicide prevention, and mental health first aid. This afternoon, Jessica will share her expertise and actionable advice on how we can protect our well-being while continuing our vital work in the animal welfare space. I would like to inform everyone that this afternoon's session will be divided into 3 segments. First, we will explore the various facets of compassion fatigue and its symptoms. Secondly, we will discuss the importance of self-care and resilience and share some effective tools and techniques to safeguard your well-being. And lastly, we will examine how management can implement supportive measures and provide resources to help staff cope with this occupational hazard, ensuring a healthier, more supportive work environment. As we go through the segments, kindly leave any questions that you may have in the chat box. We will address them at each relevant segment and as well as overall session at the end of it. Without further delay, I would like to pass the session to Jessica. You may now share your screen and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Okay, let me share my slides with you. Can you all see my screen and hear me okay? Eileen, can you give me a thumbs up or let me know that you guys can see me and hear me? Great, excellent. Thanks, everyone. Well, I'm really happy to be here with you. It's very early in the morning where I am, and so my hope is that I make sense and that you all get something useful out of today's session. We're going to cover a lot of territory. You've already met me, so we'll just jump right in to doing a little bit of awareness building. When I was working in animal sheltering in the United States, I had my own experience of compassion fatigue, burnout, moral distress, traumatic stress. But at the time, I didn't have the language to talk about, understand, or share what I was experiencing. And I often felt really isolated and different in what I was experiencing. I know that that's not true now. And so my hope is that by building some awareness this morning or this afternoon, it can help you to gather the language that you need to be able to understand and share your own experiences. I always like to start this kind of conversation with this quote from Dr. Naomi Rachel Remen, who said, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." It is not reasonable to think that we could be doing this work and not be touched by it. I've been working as a compassion fatigue educator for more than 10 years. So I've spoken with thousands and thousands of people like you, like me, everywhere in the world. And we're all touched by the work that we do with animals. We're all changed by it. And it's a normal part of what we're experiencing. The really good news, I think, is that we are often changed in some profoundly positive ways. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we get to maybe the positive ways or the growth that we can experience in this work, I think we have to have an honest conversation about some of the negative impacts of the work that we do and how it affects us. And so we're going to start just with some definitions again, so we have some common language and understanding about what we may be experiencing, or maybe our team or our staff may be experiencing. So as Eileen was saying, we may be experiencing something called compassion fatigue. I think over the years, you're going to hear that term retired and replaced by a more accurate phrase or term, empathy fatigue, empathic strain, or empathic distress. And the reason for that is that we now understand that empathy and compassion impact us differently. When we have empathy for an animal or person or ecosystem that is suffering, that empathy is really, we are suffering with that other being, right? I recognize you're suffering and I'm suffering with you. And what we now know is that that is lighting up the pain center of our brain. And it's that being in constant pain that is so fatiguing, distressing, straining for us. Compassion, we now know, is lighting up a different part of our brain that's more pro-social, it's more energizing. And compassion can be understood as, I recognize you're suffering and I'm going to take action to try to relieve it. It's a verb. We can have empathy and not actually take any action. And so that's a very short explanation for why you're going to hear the terminology change. It's our empathy that is really painful and draining for us. You'll hear me use both terms because I haven't shaken the habit of saying compassion fatigue yet, but a working definition that I really like is that compassion fatigue is the profound physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual depletion that arises due to the demands of working in an intense caregiving environment in which the helpers feel the pain, stress, and emotions of others. And over time, that depletion causes a decline in our energy and ability to feel and care for others. So it's the fatigue of our empathy, not because we don't care, but because at some point we cared very, very much. And if we were unable to restore ourselves, that state of depletion and exhaustion erodes the very qualities that likely brought you to the work and that help you stay connected to others. Your empathy, your sensitivity, your hopefulness, we start to lose those things. And in animal-related work, I think we lose our empathy for people first, right? That's typically how it shows up in us, where we lose all of our empathy for the general public, the people that we might be serving, for our coworkers, our staff, volunteers, but also our family, our friends, even ourselves. And then we may also find that we start to disconnect from the animals. Again, not because we don't care, but we might find that we're becoming very numb and desensitized because of what we've experienced. So that's a little bit about compassion fatigue. That's one thing that we might experience. Another outcome that we might experience, depending on what we're exposed to in our role, is secondary traumatic stress, which is also sometimes called vicarious trauma. So secondary traumatic stress is indirect trauma exposure. It's this experience of being traumatized by witnessing and being around, animals and people who are suffering and traumatized. And secondary and primary traumatic stress can affect us in exactly the same ways. One way that it tends to affect us is that trauma exposure over time starts to change our worldview. And we might notice some pretty significant changes in our core beliefs about ourselves, who we are, about other people, and whether or not they are good or trustworthy. And we also start to see the world differently in terms of what is safe and what feels dangerous or threatening to us. And I tend to use this example a lot when I work with North American animal shelter and welfare workers. You can tell me, if you have a different experience, but just as a way of highlighting or explaining what this might look like, I always give the example of a garbage bag on the side of the road. For people who work with animals, when we see a garbage bag on the side of the road, for many of us, our very first thought is that there might be animals inside that bag that are living or deceased. And people who don't work with animals never think that. We think that because of what we have been exposed to, directly or indirectly, over the course of our careers. So something that before we started working with animals maybe didn't feel worrisome, threatening, dangerous to us. It's just a garbage bag on the side of the road. Now, because of what we've been exposed to, we might notice that we see that bag and we feel compelled to stop and check, or we feel hypervigilant, we feel very stressed. We're having maybe intrusive thoughts about past experiences that we've had. And so something that didn't used to cause us stress is now maybe a source of stress for us. And so that's just a brief example. There are many different ways that we're impacted by this. But what I have found is that most folks don't realize how they have changed over time. It kind of creeps up on us slowly until we look back and realize that we used to see the world, ourselves, other people in a very different way. And I think what I would just like to extend here is that this is normal. This is an occupational hazard to experience this change in worldview. It's very common. It's a pretty predictable consequence of being exposed to traumatized animals and people that we would start to see this shift. And while we can't unknow what we now know, like I'll never not know what leads me to think that there are animals in that bag. I'll never unknow that. But there are steps that we can take to help ourselves feel safer in the present moment, to help ourselves stay connected to others that are supportive for us. And we'll talk about that a little bit today so we can mitigate the impact of this. Another outcome that we might experience is moral distress or moral dilemmas. So moral distress is when we know what the right thing to do is, but due to circumstances or resources, we are required to act in a way that is contrary to our values. So those circumstances are typically external. So it might be a local law, a policy in the organization, an ordinance, or a lack of resources that are preventing you or the organization from doing what you believe is the right thing to do for the animals. Right? And there's this tension created between what should be done and what actually is being done. And when we experience moral distress in the moment, it kind of has this lingering effect, this moral residue, where we're thinking about it and feeling the stress of it, after the event maybe has passed. Another thing that we might be experiencing is a moral dilemma, which is different than moral distress. This is when we think that we actually did make the right choice, given that the situation is a genuine ethical dilemma, meaning both choices are upholding different values of ours. So there's not a clear right or wrong. Or the situation is truly tragic. There's no clear good, choice. All we can do is pick the less bad option. And for those of you who are familiar with harm reduction, I think that's a really helpful framework for this. We are in those situations working to reduce the harm of really terrible circumstances. And in this case, we do believe that we are making the right choice given, the really difficult circumstances that we're working with. And when we're dealing with moral dilemmas, one way that we support ourselves is really thinking it through and asking ourselves or our team, did we make our decision based on thoughtful and compassionate reasoning, right? We didn't just make this decision on a whim. We really thought this out. Did we consider the values and the trade-offs that we needed to make? And if we really did that, then we can find some mental peace that we did our best given this really difficult situation. That's really all we can ask ourselves when we're dealing with such complicated circumstances that are often beyond our control. And we'll talk a little bit more about moral distress later on. But I wanted to highlight that because moral distress is different than compassion fatigue, and it's also different than burnout. Burnout is stemming from our interactions with our working conditions, whereas compassion fatigue is stemming from our empathetic engagement with the animals or people that we're caring for. So it's more specific to being a helping professional. Burnout can happen in any job. It doesn't, you can work in a restaurant, in a hospital. It doesn't matter what you do. If the working conditions are right for it, burnout is a possibility. So burnout is a result of chronic, prolonged stress without enough resources to cope with that stress. So it's not just stress, right? Stress plus a lot of resources to cope with that stress will protect us from burnout. We're really talking about very high demands without the support, resources, control that we need to cope with those demands. And so there are 6 main drivers in the workplace for burnout, and they are work overload, right? That very high demand, a lack of autonomy, a lack of control, lack of reward, which can be financial, but it can also be appreciation and other forms of rewards, a lack of fairness, a lack of community and support, connection, and or a mismatch of values, that moral distress. So moral distress, while distinct, can feed into burnout. It can feed into compassion fatigue. And the symptoms of burnout tend to be along a spectrum, a continuum, and they include things like emotional exhaustion, cynicism, feeling ineffective at your job professionally, feeling ineffective. We may start to feel really unmotivated and disengaged as well. And again, this is a working condition issue rather than like an individual, issue. It's really looking at the systems that we're in. And so whatever the outcome may be, there are some warning signs and symptoms that are worth paying attention to in ourselves and in other people. These are some signs that maybe we are struggling with compassion fatigue, traumatic stress, burnout. And so first we'll look at a few signs. Signs are things that other people can see. It's not so private. So these are really significant, persistent changes in the way we're talking, in our behaviors. Again, other people can see it, maybe even if we can't see it in ourselves. So it might be that we're becoming much more isolated from other people, which is a very common way that all of these outcomes start to present in us. A lot of us start to really withdraw. We may be behaving in ways that are very, uncharacteristic for us, or we may notice more compulsive behaviors. We may be making more mistakes on the job. So there's a change in our functioning, in our performance, in our ability to do our jobs well. Many of us start to use substances to self-medicate, whether that's alcohol or drugs, but it could also be food, online shopping, gambling, like any work, anything that we're using to numb out, self-medicate, that sort of thing. And then there are symptoms that may be a little less obvious. It might be more of an internal experience. So this is more characterized by not feeling in control of our body, our emotions, or our thoughts. So maybe we're having a lot of trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. We're waking up in the middle of the night, or maybe we're starting to have frequent nightmares or really vivid nightmares. We may notice that we're having trouble focusing, making decisions. Our memory might not be what it was. We're having trouble thinking rationally. Maybe we're not doing the things that we used to do that we liked. So we're kind of losing our life outside of the work, or even when we try to engage in activities that we used to enjoy, we're just not really able to connect with them anymore. Maybe we're being very intentional about trying to avoid certain situations or reminders of upsetting things that we've experienced. Perhaps it's intrusive images or intrusive thoughts of things that we experienced at work, that are coming to us when we don't want to be thinking about these things. Along a spectrum, we could be feeling very numb, disconnected. That's really that in compassion fatigue, that's often the hallmark symptom, is that we start to become very desensitized and lacking in empathy. I always think of it as being behind a wall, or kind of a crusty coat of armor that we have kind of put up to protect ourselves. But when we're behind that wall, not only is it maybe keeping out the bad, but it's also keeping out all of the good, the connections, the satisfying and meaningful parts of our work. So it's not a place we want to be all the time. But the other end of that spectrum would be that we're feeling very intensely. Maybe we're having really disproportionate emotional reactions to things that feel out of character for us. Or, the far end, we're starting to experience panic attacks or really intense anger, rage, very intense guilt or shame. And, all of these things can happen some of the time and it would be normal. Again, we're kind of talking about when these are experiences that we're having that are pretty persistent, they're ongoing. So we're looking at the intensity of the sign or symptom, the duration, and its impact on our ability to function. So in other words, it's perfectly normal to be angry and have a hard time sleeping some of the time. That's just a symptom of being human. But if this is something that's happening in an ongoing way and it's affecting your quality of life, your ability to function, maybe it's related to some of what you are experiencing on the job. And then the positive thing that I want to kind of end this section on is that we can also experience vicarious resilience. So not just vicarious trauma, but we can also experience vicarious resilience because we have the great privilege of getting to watch other people and animals heal from their experiences of trauma. And I always share this photo. These are my two dogs. That's Billy with the giant head and Turtle with the giant ears. And both of my dogs came from cruelty cases where they had the worst first year of their lives. And now they're with me. And they are both the happiest dogs on the planet. And they're really loving. And it's a reminder for me all the time that it is possible for us to heal from the trauma that we experience. Not always, but it is a possibility. And so people who experience vicarious resilience report having a greater perspective on the world. I think they're less judgmental, they're more compassionate, they tend to have more appreciation and gratitude for the good things in the world. They're more realistically optimistic. They have hope for their own healing. Thanks, guys. I think they're really cute too. They have hope for their own healing, right? Like I know that it's possible for me to heal from my past experiences of trauma because they have healed. And so it gives us hope for ourselves, but it also translates into a really profound commitment to the work or a deeper sense of meaning. And so this is possible for us too, even though we are witnessing so much trauma. Vicarious resilience doesn't cure us of vicarious trauma. They can actually exist at the exact same time, meaning I can still think that, that garbage bag has animals in it. And I can think, that the world, is that it's possible to heal, that there are good things happening in the world. And one of the really interesting things about vicarious resilience is we are more likely to experience it once we know that it is possible. So now, excuse me, you all know that it is possible. And so all of you are more likely to experience it, not as a cure, but as something that kind of can mitigate some of the difficult things that we're experiencing. So we'll talk about what we can do to help ourselves and each other in a moment. But do we have any questions that I can answer about any of this? Or Eileen, you tell me where to go next.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for the very insightful nature of the different kind of stresses that we face and how all of us can learn to distinguish between them. All right, let me see if there are any questions to go through. Um, the, there is something that I would like to ask. So sometimes one personal circumstances can also significantly impact the likelihood of a person's experiences of compassion fatigue. So in that case, how can a person be mindful of their own situation in helping themselves better manage the occupational stress and developing effective coping skills from there?
Yeah, so I think it's important just to recognize that sometimes it's the stress or trauma we're experiencing in our personal lives that is ultimately, feeding into maybe our experience of compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma on the job. We can't really separate it out. We're just one human. And so all of these symptoms might be a result of the cumulative nature of what we're experiencing at home in our personal lives, including our past. If we have a past history of unresolved, unhealed trauma, that's going to make us more vulnerable to the trauma that we're exposed to at work. And so one of the things that might be helpful, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the next segment, is sometimes we do need the help of a counselor or a therapist or a practitioner of some sort who can help us to work through and heal some of that past trauma. So it's not so much of an open wound that we're bringing to the work. That's one thing. And I think the other thing is just to be really mindful of that cumulative nature. So if we're going through a hard time at home, we're going through a breakup, or we have a sick parent or child or pet at home, or whatever it is, that this is going to make us that much more vulnerable to what we're experiencing every day. And I think it's just that awareness that we're bringing, being really mindful of how those symptoms might be presenting in us and how they might be fluctuating or changing. So typically we tend to not pay attention to ourselves until we're in a lot of trouble. We ignore all those signs and symptoms I just mentioned until we're in such bad mental and physical shape that we cannot ignore ourselves any longer because we're really we're ill. We can't function anymore. And part of the way that we take care of ourselves is bringing greater real-time awareness to our current levels of stress and those symptoms and how they might be fluctuating as our stress levels rise at home or at work. And that gives us the opportunity to intervene for ourselves. And we'll talk about that in a minute, sooner rather than later, because the sooner we can intervene for ourselves or, and get the help that we need, typically the easier it is to turn things around. And I think we understand that through our work with animals. The longer we wait to treat a medical or a behavioral issue, the more resource intensive it becomes, the longer it might take. It's still possible. It's just maybe a little bit more challenging. So that self-awareness, tracking our symptoms in real time, really paying attention to our cumulative loads of stress, can give us real-time information about how we might need to adjust the way that we're approaching work or life, or getting more support. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. It's very clear and simple to understand. Thank you for that. Um, well, like when you mentioned just now, earlier, vicarious resilience, it's available to everybody once we know that it's possible and it's just there. But sometimes, a lot of us may be just trapped within this sphere where we do not acknowledge that, or like it's not a conscious choice that we are purposefully not acknowledging that there is positivity out there, that you can accept that and embrace that. Why would you, what reasons would you say that leads to a person being that, and then how can they, like, an easy step to overcome that in a way?
I wish I had the easy steps.
Not
I keep hoping someone will come up with a vitamin or a smoothie that will cure this.
yeah.
And then, like, I'm out of business and I can go walk dogs for a living. But so there's no easy solution. But what I will say is that it's perfectly normal that we are hyper focused on the negative. We have a negativity bias in our brain under the best circumstances where we very easily focus on and remember negative situations, which, in our evolution as humans help to keep us alive. We remembered, what animal or what food, berry, mushroom was poisonous and, remember it quickly so we never eat that again. We're not very good or built to notice and really soak in the positive experiences that we have. And that's under, again, normal circumstances. When you're experiencing chronic stress and or trauma exposure, that negativity bias really goes off the charts, where we become very hypervigilant, very sensitive to perceived threats and negative situations. And so it would make sense that it's hard to do. We'll talk about that a little bit, about, how difficult it is to kind of shift to the positive. So it's normal. And then we need to bring so much intentionality to noticing the good or even the neutral. Sometimes when we're really stuck in the negative, and I've been there, there's no judgment for me. I'm the very, very negative human when I'm under a lot of stress. But if we can, sometimes it's very hard to jump from the negative to maybe the positive. It's, can we go somewhere in the middle where we find things that are neutral? They're not good or bad, and we just start to train ourselves to find like things that are okay-ish. And then maybe we can make a leap to also noticing that there are some good things that are happening even on the worst days. And this is a really important part of being well in these type of professions, but it takes real intention and a commitment to doing this. It pays off. The research is pretty clear about that, but it's not going to come naturally for most of us, given the stress load that we're carrying and the kind of the bias in our brain. So we may need to partner up with someone else to make a commitment to talking about these things in our meetings, to sharing these things over dinner at night. And it's often really challenging at first. So if you're struggling with it, you're in really good company.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from the audience, which can lead easily into segment two. Basically, there is a group of dog feeders who often sound very sad about numerous challenges that they come across every day. And there are times when they share instances that they are not able to sleep because they could not feed a dog or help a dog. So how can we help enthusiasts like them to deal with their signs so that we can prevent the burnout that they feel?
Yeah, I think first it's just acknowledging that it is normal that they're having intrusive thoughts about the animals the dogs that they're seeing, that they're not able to help, that it is morally distressing, it's compassion fatigue, it's all of these things. So just normalizing it first, like there's nothing wrong with them and it's normal to be having some of these symptoms. Do you want to kind of shift into what are some of the things we can do to help ourselves? Because that way I won't repeat myself in the next section. And then I'll come back to this question. If nothing I say help you with that answer in the next section, I promise to revisit the question, okay? Yeah, so okay, let me keep going and then we'll come back. So this second section is how we can take care of ourselves, but also how we can support each other. And the number one thing that we can do is to really invest in supportive social connections. What we know from the research is that social connectedness is one of the strongest protective factors we've got against any form of stress injury, and stress injury being an umbrella term for all of those outcomes that I just talked about. Social connectedness is linked to emotional well-being and helping us to recover after traumatic stress and loss. And so there's a few different kinds of social support that we can offer. Helping professionals and caregivers have reported that instrumental support is their top choice for the way that they want to be supported by their coworkers. And that's offering assistance with basically tasks, lending a hand, giving material aid, versus more informational support, like giving people advice. But that's helpful sometimes too. And then there's emotional support, which is when we offer empathy, we reassure people that what they're experiencing is normal, they're not alone, and giving people opportunities to talk about what they're experiencing. We like informational support and emotional support too, but instrumental support is almost always the number one choice. And then often it's emotional support. What can be very low on the list is informational, meaning most of us actually don't want advice. We just want someone to listen and be there for us and maybe lend a hand with like our workload that is so overwhelming. The other thing that is really helpful is inclusion, because it's so typical for people to isolate themselves when they're stressed or experiencing any form of stress injury. we can really support each other by making an effort to pull people back in, to help them re-engage with their community, with their coworkers or volunteers. So that can be as simple as just like inviting someone to have coffee with you or asking them to help you with a task. You're getting help with something that you need to do, but you're helping them by saying, hey, spend some time with me and, help me clean these cages or whatever you need to do. And I know that you're all so busy that you can't even get your own work done, let alone help someone else. But if we can just lend each other a hand here and there, it can be really short. It just goes a long way in sustaining us. And then, of course, there are all those other ways that we can support each other too. It doesn't always have to be material aid. The other thing I would suggest is that we need to give people explicit permission to check in on us. Asking for help is incredibly hard. There's a lot of stigma to saying, I need help. We may feel that it makes us look weak. We may be worried that our peers will judge us, think that we can't handle the stress of the work. We may be afraid that if we ask for help, we'll lose our job. So there's a lot of barriers to asking for help. And that's what we're always telling people to do. Reach out, get help. It's hard. It's really hard. It's also hard to offer help. Again, I've had this conversation for 10 years. We're all kind of concerned that if we ask people, are you okay? Or I'm worried about you, that will make the other person feel awkward or embarrassed. And so can we make offering help easier? Asking for help is going to be hard. In the meantime, can we make offering help a little easier? So we can do this by buddying up, like pick one person that you trust at work. And if there's nobody at work, maybe it's someone in your personal life. And then share your warning signs with each other. So how does stress, compassion, fatigue, traumatic stress tend to show up for you? So I tend to isolate. I stop sleeping. I get really short tempered, whatever it is. You let the other person know how you tend to change, and then let that other person know how you prefer to be checked in on. So I prefer that you check in face to face with me in person, or I prefer that you text me privately, off hours, rather than talk to me in real time, whatever it might be. And then give each other permission to say something if we see something, right? So if you see that I am isolating myself, I'm not talking in meetings anymore, I'm not, having lunch with anybody, that's not normal for me. That's a sign that I'm not doing okay. Or if you're just concerned in general, it is okay for you to compassionately call me out and say, hey, friend, I noticed that you've been really quiet lately. You told me that that's a warning sign. So I'm just mentioning this because I care. I want to know how you're doing. Am I right that something might be going on here? And if we can have that really explicit conversation with each other, then it just breaks down a lot of the stigma and barriers to asking for or even offering help. So this can be a powerful practice with one person or a whole team. And then at some point, there's going to, be a moment where we realize that we may not be enough to help each other out, right? When people are experiencing pretty serious illness or injury, it's often beyond what we can do, right? We're not clinicians. And so we need to know for ourselves and for those that we support, when is it time to bridge them to professional care? When is it time for us to reach out to the professionals for help? So, reaching out for mental health help, talk about stigma. There's so many barriers to this, but this is really a sign of strength. And I encourage you to consider professional help if you are taking care of yourself or you are increasing your self-care and you're getting peer support, but your symptoms are getting worse or they're failing to improve. These are signs that we may need to talk with the doctor or a counselor about, what's happening for us. But also, if you would like help safely feeling your emotions or healing from past trauma, right? If you feel really overwhelmed by the pain that you're experiencing, this could be a time to talk with a therapist or a counselor or a practitioner who can help you to start to feel those feelings a little bit at a time, open the door slowly so that you can more safely kind of start to touch into that backlog of pain or trauma that, you've been trying to kind of keep locked up because it's so overwhelming. That's when someone can help you. But especially if you're feeling hopeless or you're having even passing thoughts of suicide, harming yourself, then we really want to reach out. There's that link has international suicide hotlines and warm lines. This is when we want to reach out. We don't want to be alone in this. These are more common experiences than we might think. We're not as unique or alone in feeling this way as we might feel that we are. So we want to reach out. We don't want to be alone in that experience. But also, if we're having symptoms of clinical depression or an anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, this is another time when we really need to reach out to a clinician. And post-traumatic stress can occur from secondary traumatic stress, not just primary or direct trauma. So it's important to understand that we may be experiencing this even if we haven't had a direct primary experience of trauma personally. And then I would just say, just because it's really hard to be a human being in this world right now, this is a tough time to be alive. It is exceptionally hard to be a human being doing the type of trauma exposed work that you all do. And so it's actually a very proactive, smart thing to get into a relationship with a counselor of some sort when you're doing okay, before you're in crisis. It is okay, you are allowed to reach out for help when you're doing so and you want help staying that way versus waiting until we're absolutely in crisis and we're really in a state of intense distress and we need immediate help. So you can just reach out because it's hard. It's hard to do what you do. And it's great to have someone in your corner who can listen to you and support you and help you process your feelings and your stories. Okay, so another practical thing that maybe is not so complicated that we can do for ourselves is at the end of our workday, we need to do something to end the kind of perpetual stress response that we get stuck in. We're experiencing a lot of fight, flight, or freeze reactions all throughout the day, and we need help metabolizing that cortisol and adrenaline out of our body so that we can get into a state of parasympathetic recovery after our work day is done. We tend to think that if the work day is done and then we're just off, that is going to be enough to recover. But if our body is still stuck in the stress cycle, lots of cortisol, lots of adrenaline, we never get into that parasympathetic rest and recover, digest, rest and connect, all of the things that we need to be well. We can't quite get there because we're stuck in fight or flight. So it typically takes about 20 minutes of intentional activity to end the stress cycle. And we can do that through letting ourselves cry, laughing, creative hobbies or activities, talking with friends that are caring, doing some breath work, exercising, sweating out some of the stress hormones that are in our body, or even affection, like long hugs, cuddling with your pets. So it would be 20 minutes of one of these activities or all of them combined, or some of them combined. So you might just take your dog for a walk like Sarah does, or you might let yourself have that big cry that you had to hold back all day in order to do your job. And then after crying, maybe you'll watch some funny videos and laugh it out for a little bit. Both of those things can help flush out all of the stress in your body so that you can shift into that rest and recovery mode. We tend to think that resilience is just bouncing back from stress, but we jump over the recovery part. We're resilient when we experience stress and then we allow ourselves to recover from it. Without that recovery time, resilience is really hard to access. And so we, again, need to be intentional about shifting our nervous system and our body into that recovery zone after work. The other thing we can look at is how effective is our self-care. A lot of us, when we're really exhausted, which I know most of you are probably, we tend to do a lot of passive self-care. So that type of self-care is, lying on the couch and watching a lot of YouTube videos or scrolling, TikTok, or just kind of like, taking in a lot of content. And while that can be great, lying in bed all day is beautiful some of the time. If we're only doing passive rest, we may find that we're not actually regaining our energy. We may even notice that our mood is starting to, to get even more depressed. So I would just encourage you to pay attention to the current self-care that you are doing. Is what you are doing sustaining you right now, or do you actually notice that it's draining you? It's okay for your self-care to change. What worked for you years ago may not be working for you now. What works for your coworker may not work for you. So is this self-care activity sustaining or, giving me energy, or is it actually draining me? Am I making a conscious choice to watch another episode, or am I just kind of stuck in that automatic feed where, another thing just keeps playing? So how, again, intentional is the word of the day today. How intentional am I being? I'd love to know from all of you what kind of self-care is ultimately very helpful for you. What is the activity or what thing, do you choose to do that you notice you gain energy from it? And I asked the folks at AfA, what they like to do, and they shared things like they like to share time with spend time with their friends and loved ones. And again, remember, social connectedness is like some of the best medicine we can have. So being around our friends, even when we're exhausted, often replenishes our energy. Interacting with nature and being with animals, or being with animals in a positive way, can be very sustaining. I remember this from my time too at the animal shelter. I started to think that, like, I just couldn't see that anything good was ever happening for animals ever. And so it was really helpful for me to shift and be around animals who were well cared for, who were, really loved and safe. And that was very affirming for me. But also to do a hobby that doesn't have anything to do with your work. I would say that this is one of the number one strategies that people have reported to me over the years. Folks who are pretty resilient, who have done this work for a long time, share that having a hobby outside of the work that has nothing to do with animals or caregiving, where people don't even really know about their work with animals, and they can be almost like a different person, setting all of that aside, is one of the most helpful things. So that might look like being really into gardening, getting into certain kinds of flowers, or having a certain type of exercise that you do, or craft hobby, being involved in acting or music, or anything where you can really let it all go and just be, who you are outside of the work. So a mix of more active rest and passive rest can be really helpful. When you're exhausted, it can feel very challenging to go out with a friend or go for a walk in nature. But I would really encourage you to experiment with that if passive rest is not helping you right now. It may be that we need to push ourselves over that initial kind of tiredness to get into these activities. And then we might find that it is really restoring us. Yeah, going for a walk in the woods, moving your body. Yeah, lots of cats along the way. That's great. Yeah, being with trees. I have some favorite trees that I like to go hang out with. The sound of birds. I agree. Go for a run. Yeah, sweating it out is really underrated. We are animals too, and we need to like move that out of our bodies, all that, excessive activation. Yeah, good run, good sweat out, some weights. Bird watching for me too. I really, that's been a big help for me. I have an app on my phone. I don't know what you all have access to. In North America, we have the Cornell bird watching app. I'm trying to remember what it's called, but you can record the sound of birds around you, and in real time, it tells you the birds that you're hearing. And so when I have been at my most depleted, my most grief saturated, one of the most restorative activities for me has been sitting outside with that app, and learning about, not just listening to the birds, but also learning about who I'm listening to. And that has been really helpful for me. So Merlin, yes, thank you. So that Merlin has been a real, really a productive part of my self-care over the years. So maybe you can experiment with that too. Yeah, yeah, being barefoot in a grassy patch, that's great. I love that too. Thank you for the link. I hope that you guys have access to it. It's great because you're passive, like you can be lying on the ground or barefoot in the grass, but you're also engaging your brain and listening, which is that engagement of the brain is really helpful because you won't slip back into thoughts about work so easily versus like social media or watching TV. Sometimes it's easy to start ruminating about work again. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, but feel free to keep adding things in the chat. I think it's really helpful to learn from each other. So this was what Eileen was getting at, I think, before, is that it's really important that we intentionally share the good. So the research shows that social connection is really helpful, but so is perception of impact and having a sense of purpose. They serve as buffers against stress and trauma. And so we can make a real effort to connect with each other through talking about how we're making an impact or our sense of purpose. So, can we be more generous in sharing appreciation for one another, talking about the things that are going well? Because we tend to only talk about the problems and what's going wrong. Can we have meetings or conversations where we really make that effort to share some of the wins or just some of the small things that are going well personally and professionally, or taking time to reflect on the meaning, the purpose, the impact of our efforts. And I would say that talking about even partial successes or what we've learned from a difficult experience can also count. It doesn't always have to be a big, obvious win. You all, the AfA group, told me that they have an internal Slack channel for their team called the Friday Smile. So it can be through technology that we are sharing some of the good things at work in our lives, or it could be that, you know, when we have our meetings together, we just commit to sharing one thing that went well before we get into what problems we need to fix. And I can tell you that when over the last decade, this is one of the most common things that people tell me, staff, employees tell me that they would like more of at work. They want to celebrate the wins a little bit more. They don't want it to, they don't want to get into toxic positivity. That's important, but we tend to just be so hyper focused on the negative. We take no time to really soak in and take note of the good stuff. And so we're going to practice doing that a little bit today because it is really challenging to do because of that negativity bias. So what is something that went well for you in your work in this past week or past month? It can be something very, very small. It doesn't have to be an enormous thing, but what's something that went well? And what was your role or your team's role in making that good thing happen? And if you can't think of anything at work, maybe you can share something that is good that happened in your life recently and what your role was in that good thing. So, for example, if a good thing was that you listened to the birds singing, your role in making that happen is that you pause long enough to hear the birds, because we all know that there are lots of days where we never even slow down long enough to really hear them, right? So it may just be the good thing maybe that your coworker brought you a cup of coffee, and your role in making that happen was that you have developed a friendship with that person. You take time to show them that you care, and so it's reciprocated. But what are some good things maybe that happened at work? Was there something that, an outcome that was good, or was it even something where you came together and you worked really hard as a team, even if the outcome wasn't what you hoped for? You really connected well with your coworkers. Maybe you secured a grant. Maybe you just had a really great conversation with a coworker or a staff member that helped you to feel more supported. So I don't see anything in the chat yet. And what I would say, here we go. There's a couple. It is hard. If you're struggling to come up with something good to share, normal. This is the hardest question that I ask people. It's always a challenge. And so this is what I mean by we have to really practice this. So yeah, you did partner with me. Yeah. You managed to launch a rebooted version of your animal welfare digital education program. Yes, despite all the setbacks and the problems, it happened. Right. And so taking time to celebrate that it actually happened. How many of us have spent years trying to make something happen, and then it finally happens and we're like, oh great, okay, on to the next problem that we have to solve. So just taking time to really celebrate that. Yeah, you are awesome. That's great. Having very helpful teammates and interns. Yeah. So what I would say about this is that The more you do this, the easier it gets. It's very hard in the beginning. Once you start committing to, I'm going to share something good at the start of every meeting, or every, Friday, we're going to share something in the Slack channel, or every night before I go to bed, I'm going to write down some good things that happened. Once you start making that a practice, it does actually start to change your brain a little bit, and you start to notice the good things a little bit more easily throughout your day. And if you can also notice what your role was in making that good thing happen, what the research shows is that that combination of noticing what's going well and your role in making it happen can actually start to not only improve our mood and just generally help uplift us, but it does help to reduce burnout because we start to notice that we do have some power. We're often feeling very disempowered at work, and we start to realize my choices do matter. I am making a difference in some ways that I tend not to acknowledge. Yeah, so you as a team, you secured a really exciting wildlife crime project, soon to be launched, a massive team effort, which took months. Yeah, so just taking a little time out to celebrate this and to look at the choices that you made, the power that we do have, even if that power is as simple as taking time to pause long enough to notice the good things that are happening. So we're going to get into in the last little bit some of the things we can do as an organization or leadership can do. But are there any questions or anything that I can address before we go into that last section? I'm going to let my cat out of the room. She really wants to leave. Here we go.
Okay. Cat is out of the bag.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of scratching going on behind me.
I think we're good for now. We
Okay.
can continue on with the,
Yep.
yeah, I think we're
Okay.
saving the best bits for the last.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
we can get into more questions at the very end. This is just a quick look at leadership actions. This, every one of these sections could have been 10 hours. So forgive me, this is just a quick look at what we can do at more of an organizational level. It's just critically important that we acknowledge that self-care is a very, very important, critical part of anyone's resilience, but it's really insufficient on its own because context matters. Our environment, our working conditions impact our resilience. So what we really need is for individuals to take responsibility for taking care of themselves, and we need our organizations to take responsibility for creating healthy, humane working conditions for the humans doing this work. And when both of those things are happening at the same time, that is when we really have the potential to have a resilient workforce that can move our mission forward, do the most ethical, effective, sustainable work. And I just want to really reiterate that it's both and, it's not either or. We tend to think our self-care doesn't matter. It only matters if the organization fixes working conditions, or we think working conditions don't matter. We just need our staff to take care of themselves. It's always, always both and, not either or. They're very important. And so the reason we talk, I think, a lot about self-care is often that's the only thing we have control over if we don't have the institutional power to change working conditions. So, if you're not in a leadership role, self-care is what you have control over. If you are in a leadership role, this is really critical that you take responsibility for this part of the equation. And so what I'll say is, because of the power differential between you and your staff, if you are a manager, supervisor, director, a leader of any kind, that power differential means that you have a very disproportionate influence on your staff. You are highly contagious to them, even more so maybe than their coworkers. And so we really want to look at, what are we spreading to our workers? Are we, relatively well? Are we relatively calm? Are we realistically optimistic? Like, are we noticing the good? Because that is what we will spread. It will ripple out to our team. If we are burned out, if we are really reactive and stressed out, if we are very pessimistic, that is what is going to spread to our team. And so if we want to help our team to be well, then we really have to take care of ourselves first. And so when I talk to managers, supervisors, leaders, they all want, for the most part, their workers, their employees to, feel better, to not be compassion fatigued. They want them to take care of themselves, to set boundaries, and they tell them to do it, but they're not walking the walk. They are not doing it. And if you, as a manager or a leader, if you are not taking care of yourself, if you are not setting boundaries with work, then you are sending a very mixed message to your employees that maybe even though you're saying it's okay, maybe it's actually not okay for them to do it because you're not. Or they know it's okay, but they're just so worried about you. They can see that you're not okay, and believe me, they're worried about you. And so one of the most effective ways of helping our employees, our staff, is caring for ourselves and then modeling that for our workers, encouraging them to follow our lead. And again, it's going to spread whatever you're doing, however you're feeling. So if you want to care for your staff, double down on supporting yourself. And then it really is going to ripple out to them. And that means that you have to look at what support do you need. It's really lonely to be in a leadership, a manager role. Often we can't get the support that we need, even within the organization, because of different power dynamics. And so we might have to look outside of our immediate organization. That's why AfA Coalition is so important, getting together in live events like this where we can meet our colleagues and our peers, our counterparts in other organizations. It also may look like getting support from professionals, from your doctor, a therapist, that sort of thing. But we definitely want to reduce the isolation and that I think, sense of responsibility that we're carrying all alone on our shoulders. You need the same care that your staff needs. You just may not be able to get it from them. You may have to go outside of the organization. And if you're in the top leadership role, the way that you help your frontline workers is by investing and caring for your mid-level managers, right? So we really want to make sure they're well trained and supported, and that will trickle down to everybody else. If we want to look at increasing or improving some of the working conditions, we're going to try to flip the dynamics of burnout. So we want to increase resources, increase support, and a free thing, it takes no money, that we can do is to be very, very generous with offering authentic and timely appreciation for your staff. People who do not feel appreciated, right? Remember that a lack of reward is a driver of burnout. Reward isn't always about financial compensation, although all of you deserve to be paid more. Reward is also about feeling valued and appreciated. And if we do not feel valued, it's one of the top reasons why we quit. If we do feel valued and appreciated, it often will help us to stay, even though the working conditions are stressful. So don't wait until an annual performance review. When you see something, say something. I just saw you do this. This is a positive impact that your action or your behavior had. I really appreciate that. Not only does it make people feel good, but it also is positive reinforcement, helping them to continue to do more of what you would like them to do, right? It helps to drive that behavior and increase it. And we can really appreciate the effort that they're putting in, not just celebrating those wins that I was mentioning. We can celebrate the effort because that's what's within their control. The outcomes are not in their control. And then we can listen without even giving advice. There's a book called The Burnout Challenge, and one of the most common responses when employees were asked what would help to prevent burnout was some variation of, I wish I had someone to talk to at work, that I could talk to safely and privately whenever I have a problem or I need some help. We really need to make some space to allow our employees to talk with us about the stressful nature of the work. And we don't even have to have any answers. We don't have to have the ability or the answers, the advice to fix it for them. We can just listen and have empathy and reassure them that we're there for them. We can help them figure out what might be helpful, what kind of support they need. We can ask things like, would it be helpful for me to share my own experience or what was helpful for me? But really, it's about listening. I don't think I can overstate how hungry people are to feel seen and heard in a world where everyone is so distracted, we never get anybody's undivided attention. So if you can give someone 10 minutes in your office where they can just share how, they're feeling about the work or how something has impacted them, and just give them your empathy and attention, that's very healing and supportive. We don't always have to get into like performance management or advice giving. We can also look to increase control, that autonomy that people need. So give your staff choices in how they do their work, especially the tasks that are the most emotionally taxing. When it comes to the hardest tasks, they should have as much choice as possible in how they are doing it. They may not be able to choose whether or not they do it, but how they do it. Your highest achievers are at your highest risk for burnout. So those are the folks that we want to give as much autonomy to as possible. And we also want to avoid giving them, the most work. We tend to punish our hardest workers by just giving them more and more work so that they're picking up the slack for people who are not really pulling their weight. And this is just going to contribute to their burnout. We can also offer more control over their schedule and more flexibility, particularly if we're working really long hours. How can we have a little bit more flexibility in that? Meaning, do we have the ability to leave during the workday and go to the dentist and then come back to work? Do we have the ability to kind of, work with our boss to figure out what shifts might be the most helpful for us while we're taking care of a sick parent? Even if the hours are really long, that kind of flexibility and control can really reduce a lot of pressure and stress. And then finally, we have to look at ways at reducing or managing demands. If you manage humans, if you are a leader, I really encourage you to read the book, The Burnout Challenge. And a really practical tip they have is we need to fix the easy stuff, right? And so their advice is a minor stressor can act like a pebble in one's shoe. The pain and frustration it causes may be low level, but it's constant, and it's a great relief when that is lessened or eliminated. So a lot of the problems that we need to address are going to take time, right? It takes time to get more staffing. It takes time to get a pay raise through, but it doesn't take a lot of time to, order the right equipment that they need, or make sure that they have access to a clean break room to have lunch, or that they have access to water or something like that during their day. So what are the things, if you could ask your staff, and I encourage you to do it, what are the really simple, easy things that just are frustrating, annoying, stressful that you could immediately address? It could be stuff like the copy machine never works, or there's not enough leashes, to walk the dogs, or someone once told me there's no uniforms that fit me right. They're all too big or too small. These are things that don't take a lot of time or effort or resources to fix. And then you are reducing the cumulative load of stress that they are carrying. So they have more capacity to cope with some of the more complex stressors that are unavoidable in the work that they're doing. And then this is the harder one, but it's critical. We have to set more realistic goals and expectations. We have to redefine what success means. Are you taking staff welfare into account when you are setting goals or expectations for this year's, plans? Are you taking the current functional capacity of your workers into consideration when you're setting these goals? And by functional capacity, I mean, just because someone is there doesn't mean they are operating at 100%. So a lot of our workers are dealing with traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, burnout, personal stressors. And so even though they're there, they may only be functioning at maybe 60 or 70% of their capacity. And so on top of that, most of our organizations are understaffed. So maybe you are only 80% staffed, and of those staff members, they are not at 100%. Are you setting goals? Are your expectations calibrated for 100% functional capacity, 100% fully staffed? Or are you taking into consideration that you're running low, you're short-staffed, and folks are really not doing well right now? Or maybe people are doing well, but they're all brand new to the work. So they're feeling great, but they're very low on technical skill right now, and they're going to need a year to build up that knowledge and skill before they are at 100% functional capacity. We have to readjust and recalibrate our goals, our expectations, what success looks like based on the human beings that are doing this work. And I really encourage you to think about, how will your staff know when they have succeeded or done enough for the day, given that the work is never done and the needs always outweigh the resources, right? People are working very, very hard every day and still going home feeling like they have failed because they weren't able to do everything on their to-do list, because they weren't able to meet all of the needs of the animals, because they're short-staffed or under-resourced. And so they go home feeling guilty, like they failed, like they've done something wrong. And this is not accurate. They've worked really hard. They did a great job. There's no reason to feel guilty. They didn't do anything wrong. You, as a leader, as a supervisor, need to help them really feel like they have succeeded because they've worked hard and did their best with the limited resources they have. You have to help them understand that it is safe to psychologically to put the work down and go home at the end of the day, because the work will be there again tomorrow. It's never going to be over. It's always going to be there. We need to rest. Your workers need to rest so that they have they have the energy to show up again the next day and do good quality work, right? That's okay, that's allowed. That's that modeling and encouraging healthy boundaries part. I'm not saying it's easy to do this, but we really do need to help them feel like, hey, what you did today mattered. Your efforts mattered. You did make a difference. Let it go for now. It's safe to put it down. We'll try again tomorrow. Okay, that's it. So now we're going to go on to questions. But before we go into questions, I just want to let you know that we do have some free stuff that's coming in the fall. Sarah can back me up on this. I don't know how you want to explain it, but there's going to be a little mini free course that I'm going to offer this fall. If you would like to know about that course when it is available, or you would like to receive my newsletter or get access to some of my resources, you can scan that QR code and it will take you to my website where you can access resources or sign up for my newsletter. I also want to say that before I take questions here, if you would like to ask me a question privately, which I understand, you are welcome to email me after, jessica@jessicadolce.com. It might take me a little bit to get back to you. Email is, it's a lot, but I promise that I will reply. So you don't have to feel pressured to ask your question publicly. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet now. And then Eileen, let me know what questions that you have.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very, very much for your insights. It was so helpful, so beneficial. So many of the strategies sounds extremely practical and easy to put in place. Yeah, but we have this habit to overlook all the positive impact that they can bring for ourselves and people we work with. Okay, yeah, there is an interesting question from the audience. How do you get managers of organizations to take compassion fatigue and burnout seriously when sometimes they might see it more like an inconvenience or a snowflake type of problem?
So I get this question a lot, and I wish I had a really great answer for this. It really depends on your leadership, and your relationship with them. But I think the first thing I would say is that if they have really no empathy around this, like they really do not believe that it is an issue, and that they have the attitude of everybody should just suck it up and deal with the stress, that then we might want to switch to trying to make the financial or the business case for why we need to create healthier working conditions, because it's really clear that when workers are experiencing chronic stress, trauma, that this is impacting the quality of the work that they're doing. So they're much less effective. They're making mistakes. They're not performing well. All the things that I went over with those signs and symptoms. But also, we're definitely dealing with absenteeism and turnover. And so turnover is really expensive. Every time someone leaves, you're then short-staffed and you have to go through the hiring process and the training process. And so you're losing a lot of money in that, time period. It is more cost effective to invest in your staff and keep them and retain that institutional knowledge than it is to keep churning and burning through your staff. Financially, there's a cost to that. If anybody's interested in that, I can share a couple of little like PDFs on the business case for why we need to address these issues within our organization. So I think that's one way to approach it. If you feel like your leadership might be a little bit more receptive, it could be that you tell them, like, I went to this presentation, it was really helpful, here's what I learned. These are occupational hazards. These are predictable, normal consequences of working with, a traumatized population. And what I learned is that it can affect our ability to do ethical, effective, sustainable work. It's not just me that is experiencing this. It's really common. There's a lot of research that backs it up that this is a common experience, and that there are practical things that we could be doing to support ourselves, and we need your help as well. And can we talk about what that might look like? The other part I would say, if like that is off the table, is to get into those pebbles, try to get into a specific working condition that you want to see changed. So if looking at this in a broader way it's not going to fly. Let's identify what are some small, kind of more direct changes that we can request. That remember that it is the cumulative nature of those pebbles, those smaller stressors adding up, that contribute to this massive load that we're carrying. So what are some equipment changes or training, things that you need, or something very practical? And can you you don't have to even get into your own stress or compassion fatigue. You can just talk about how you need this training or equipment or support in order to be able to effectively execute your tasks. And then if you can start addressing some of those basic workplace hygiene issues, then your overall stress is going to go down. And that frees you up to kind of just deal with the inherent stressors of the work and a little bit less of the working condition issues. I'm not saying any of this is easy. This is a really frustrating and difficult part of our work, is this kind of divide between leadership and staff not really having an understanding or appreciation of what's happening for frontline workers. So you're not alone in your organization in struggling with that.
Thank you. But I guess it's also important to, I don't know, like to recognize here that, well, management, somehow as staff, we always expect management to support their teams and ourselves. But I guess it's also crucial to remember that management are also humans, and maybe they are facing their own personal challenges and do not know how to bring it to the team.
Yes.
And if we can balance these expectations with compassion and understanding for everyone's circumstances, I guess that will help a lot in the
It
long
will.
run.
And my hope is that
Yeah.
there's maybe a generational change coming too, in the sense that so I'm 45, so people my age and older weren't given any of this information or training when we were coming up in this field. And so I think that there is either a real lack of knowledge, they truly don't understand, or there's kind of a sense of like, well, I went through it, so you should go through it. It's like a, trial by fire. This is
Yeah.
how we haze our, new workers. And that in itself is like a trauma response, where we're not able to be maybe as compassionate or generous with younger workers because we didn't receive that kind of compassion or support when we were younger. And my hope is that, as we have more of these conversations and trainings now, and I've been really lucky to see it in the last 10 years, people that were in my classes a decade ago as younger workers are now in leadership roles, and they're having a very different approach to supporting their staff because they were given access to this information and support earlier on in their careers. So the leaders are human too, and their behavior is rooted often in what they weren't given, and the stress and struggles they're experiencing. But we still need them to take care of these working conditions. That's their responsibility for sure.
Definitely, definitely. I agree on that. Um, there's a question. very unique question about AI. How do you think technology or AI can play a role in identifying early symptoms of compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue? Like for example, the newly Apple integrated utilities to track people's movements, heartbeats. I don't know any of this. I'm very low tech. Blood pressure, or would you feel that compassion fatigue is best diagnosed and helped by people or by another person, like in
It's
the function
definitely
edit?
by people, and by people, it's you, because compassion fatigue in particular is a highly individualized experience. And so it just may not be, it's not a checklist of symptoms. Like PTSD is a very clear diagnostic list of symptoms. There's a criteria. You have these symptoms for X amount of days that, you might have PTSD. Compassion fatigue is highly individualized, and it's really an umbrella term for this experience that, Eileen and I could both have compassion fatigue and have completely different symptoms. And we're both legitimately experiencing it. So I think it would be very difficult to have AI check that. I think there's also so much overlap between compassion fatigue, burnout, secondary trauma, clinical depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, that I think AI would just explode trying to differentiate between, like, I think it would just, your computer would just start smoking, and that it would, you have all the things. And so even if it said, I think you have 15 diagnoses, like run to the nearest emergency room. You're a ghost. You don't exist anymore. I still think that you would have to, as an individual, do a lot of reflection on, well, like where are these symptoms kind of rooted? Is it related to my work? Um, or is it maybe not related to the work, and it is like a clinical depression that it's not related to my working conditions? Is the exhaustion or the emotional stress that I'm feeling related to the difficult moral dilemmas and distress it's like we're gonna have to figure out where, no matter what the diagnosis or the label is, we still have to figure out what is contributing to it in a more specific way so we can address it. So just knowing that you might have these outcomes is only part of it. We still need to know what's contributing to it in order to make more effective changes. And I'll also just say I am like technologically not very forward thinking. So maybe like Eileen, I could be totally wrong. Maybe AI is going to fix all of our problems and again put me out of business, which would be great. But my thought is it's more nuanced and individualized than that. But there are great like PTSD screeners or depression screeners, things like that. Compassion fatigue is just a little bit trickier. It's more, more individualized than that. So that's my thought on that. It's a good question. No one's ever asked that before.
Thank you, thank you. Yay, we topped that. Great on the record. Um, all right. Does anybody else have any more questions before we conclude the session? Because we're nearly at the end of the Connect session for today. It's been very interesting and very, very insightful and helpful. It's a topic that's not spoken much about, and we're very grateful that you came, sacrificing your sleeping hours to be with us and and speak to us and sharing all your knowledge about compassion fatigue. So if we do not have any more questions, before we officially conclude the session, Jessica, would you like to leave a few more words to our listeners? I think they are loving to hear from you.
Oh, well, I just want to say thank you. I'm on the other side of the planet from most of you. And so I may not know exactly what your day-to-day life is like or some of the challenges that you experience, but I think our love for animals and our empathy really connects us across the world. And I have so much respect for you and appreciation for the way that you're showing up. You all are providing such critical services and support to a really broken world. And I just appreciate your big hearts and all of the courage that you have on top of the technical skills that you have. You just have really big hearts and a lot of courage to show up and do the work. And so I always love to end with this quote: courage does not always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow. And that's all we can do, right? Is we can just show up and try. And you have my deepest appreciation for the way that you are showing up to try to help in this world. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. And if you want to keep learning, let me know. Sign up for the class that's coming, because it'll be this plus more, so we can get into even more kind of detail and more strategies together. All right, everybody. I think that's it, right? Well, then I will say thank you, everybody, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yep.
And
thank you all for joining us. Those goosebumps when you ended with the quote. Once again, yeah, once again, big thank you to you. And I would like to inform everybody that we're very excited about our upcoming launch of the program that the AfA is collaborating with Jessica, a small mini version of the Compassion and Balance program that she's running. It's called CiB/Asia. The link will be shared here, and it's free for members of AfA. Do hit the link and leave your interest on the website. And yeah, look out for more. We will also share later on our social media about CiB-Asia, the webpage that we have that we have designed to provide you with more resources so that we can help each other in this space. So I guess that's it. Thank you very much. And back to you, Ursula.
Thank you so much, Eileen. That was indeed a very insightful and resourceful session. And dear guests, if you agree with me or disagree with me with my statement just now, or would like to leave feedback about this session or the previous session or AfA in general, AfA Connect in general, we would love to hear from you. Please head over to this form. You can QR code scan it, or you can click on the link provided in the chat and fill it after this. Dear audiences, we would like to also take this opportunity to share with you our upcoming and last AfA Connect event for this year, closing with the theme Communication Matters, a United Movement. The fourth AfA Connect is scheduled on the 12th to 13 November 2024. Registration will be open soon, so for more information, please log on to asiaforanimals.com/connect. This year, we also have some exciting in-person events, such as the Asia Farm Animal Day conference, scheduled for October 9th to 11th, which will be happening in Hanoi, Vietnam. Registration is now open. And if you'd like to learn more about the conference or about the event, please go to asiafarmanimalday.com. Also, from the Farm Animal Coalition, as we internally say as FAC, the third regional event is happening in India soon. The location and the date are to be confirmed. Many more projects and events are happening in 2025. We have the Asia for Animals Conference Taipei 2025 happening from August 25th to the 29th at Taipei, Taiwan. And if you'd like to know more about our events, please head to asiaforanimals.com/events. And if you like, you can subscribe to our mailing list to get the latest information about our events. And if it's not for events, we have the podcast. So this year we launched the AfA podcast, and I would recommend to give them a listen. We have guests from all over the world, all over the globe, sharing their experiences and updates. So you can check the podcast at asiaforanimals.com/podcast. And this concludes our event for today. Thank you everyone for participating, and we will be back tomorrow for our second day of AfA Connect online event. As how they say it in Japanese, sayonara, mata aimashou. See you again tomorrow, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.